Thank you very, very much. Welcome, Stan.
Thank you.
This is
Booming out.
this is an astonishing essay because it is literary criticism, but it's also, I think, an essay about where we are as peoples and as a nation. And I was so struck by the rigor and power of the writing, and also the generosity of it. And I'm going to begin just really quickly, just a personal note to say thank you. A long time ago, I was in China and you came to a reading I did, and you extended some generosity to me. You were a bit of a hero to me, and I want to say thank you for that. And we'll talk about that generosity. And the other thing I want to say to all of you, one of the things that what made me go, I'm going to do this tonight, is the opportunity to talk to Stan, but also the opportunity in the book. He argues, and he argues with me as well. And I think we're becoming quite bad at arguing in good faith, and I'm really looking forward to more of that happening in this world. But before we begin, I really would love the audience to hear your voice. In this essay. Will you do a short reading?
Yeah, thank you for that. Before I do, I want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the people of the Kulin Nation. We have a word in my language, Yindamara Wanangana, which is to live with respect in a world worth living in. That's what our people created here for thousands of years, and what we're still struggling to do 200 plus years after invasion and colonisation. So I just want to bring that spirit of Yindamara Wanangana, and bring the spirit of my father, who wrote the first Wiradjuri dictionary, helped save our language, kept our language alive, has kept us alive as Wiradjuri people. So I want to just acknowledge my debt to all of my ancestors and to all of my family, and for the wonderful tradition of storytelling that they bequeathed to me. It's interesting you talk about the ability to argue. And I've tilted at some pretty big windmills in this book. People I love. I love Tom Keneally. I love him. What he has given to us, the letters and the generosity, and Christos and Patrick White and Tim Winton and the wonderful Indigenous writers whose voices are now being heard in this country. And I want to speak back to them. I want to get in the ring with them. I want to wrestle with them. Because that's what we do. You know, Albert Camus spoke about creating dangerously. And he said to create dangerously makes us vulnerable to a world where our passions no longer allow for forgiveness. And we have to create dangerously, and we have to speak back at passions that will have no room for forgiveness. And that's really what this book is about, is wrestling with that idea of who we are and who gets to write the story of this country. And where is the voice of people whose stories have been erased so that we can talk about Australian literature at all? In the book, I start out with this idea of ghosts. I was raised, the blackfellas here in the room will know what I'm talking about. I was raised on ghost stories. My mother told me ghost stories. The ghosts were alive, they were real. You sit down by a riverbank at night, sit under a tree at night, and just hear the voices around you. All those ghosts, all of our spirits, all of our ancestors. And in a sense, that's what Jimmy Governor, or Jimmy Blacksmith, was for me, and is for me. He's a ghost. He's a ghost that speaks from the past. He's a ghost that speaks to me. He's a ghost that I would never let go, and a ghost that I never allowed to be free of the hangman's noose. And Tom Keneally never allowed to be free of the hangman's noose. And I was looking and asking for things from Jimmy that he could never give me. And part of this essay begins with me going back to Darlinghurst Jail, where Jimmy spent the last days in a prison cell before being executed. And I write here about going to that cell and looking again at where he spent his last days and what he means to me. I can never get one image out of my mind when I think of Jimmy Governor. It is taken from the diary of one of the wardens who guarded Jimmy's cell. In the prisoner's last days, the warden wrote, Jimmy alternated between singing native songs and reading aloud passages from the Bible. What a vision! Mythic, poignant, poetic, cinematic. To the storyteller, it is profound. A man between sin and redemption, between a Christian God and the spirits of his ancestors. It reads like the final scene of a film, the distant sound of didgeridoo and clapsticks, a nasal droning voice, a lament in a language itself facing death as surely as the prisoner. Cut to a man on his knees, hands folded in prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. A cross nailed askew to the cell wall, close up of a prison warden's eyes through a keyhole. There, in Jimmy's cell, is the struggle for my own identity. I exist somewhere between the Enlightenment and the dreaming, propelled by progress and liberalism, and yet also reaching back to keep a hold on something eternal. God, sin and redemption, black and white, war and peace. This is what drew Thomas Keneally to Jimmy Governor. Like me, he has peered through the keyhole into Jimmy's cell, searching for something of himself and his country. Jimmy haunts Tom as he haunts me, as he haunts our country. He is a spectre that will not let us bury our history. He holds modernity, its promise of freedom and liberty, just out of reach.
Thank you, Stan. I believe in ghosts too. I believe in ghost history. One of the things that is most powerful about the essay is your affirmation that actually people didn't disappear, language didn't disappear, love didn't disappear. Not Jimmy Blacksmith. Jimmy Blacksmith is the character that Thomas Keneally created. What was it? And the respect and love you have for Keneally is evident in this book. But what is it that you think that Keneally why couldn't he hear? Why couldn't he get the voice of Jimmy Governor? Why couldn't he listen to that ghost?
Because of the nature of Australian settlement, how complete that is, that invasion, that death, that erasure, that inability to see us as who we are. We are a people invented by white people. There were no Aboriginal people here before white people came. We were a peoples. We had languages and love and politics and art and trade like other peoples. But with the planting of a flag, those things were erased. And we have forever lived in that eye and that gaze. We've been forever invented. And that's why Tom could not write a novel about Jimmy Governor. He could not use the name Jimmy Governor. He had to invent Jimmy Blacksmith. And Tom, with all of that empathy, looking at Aboriginal people and the suffering of Aboriginal people, wanting to hold a mirror up to Australia, to condemn Australia for the treatment of Aboriginal people, erased us. He failed to see that in spite of all of that, we were human beings. And we loved. And that's what Tom lacked. That's what Tom missed. There is no love in this book. There is doom. There is misery. There is violence. There is hatred. There is resentment. There is vengeance. There is judgment. But there is no love. And that's what he missed about us. He could not see that in the face of suffering, we were redeemed by an endless capacity to love.
I think one of the things that really struck me, and I've read the Keneally novel a couple of times. I mean, I love the novel, but reading your essay just the last couple of days, I just went back to Keneally's work, and you made me see what he didn't get was the reality of Aboriginal women. That to me, and you know, when I use the word failure, that is not a condemnation. We fail in lots of ways as
He
as
couldn't
writers.
see what
But I
he
think
couldn't see.
that's is. Do you think is that one of the largest failures in that novel?
Most definitely. And I've spoken to Tom about this, and it's hard. You know, these are hard conversations to have. They're hard conversations to have with myself. I mean, I'm tearing myself open in this, exposing myself to a world of passions that will not forgive, and judging myself harshly. Why have I wanted to hold on to Jimmy Governor or Jimmy Blacksmith as a symbol of anger or oppression? Why did that speak to something in my soul? And I think for Tom as well, he had to confront, for all of his goodwill and empathy, his failure to see us as human beings. He told me that growing up, he saw Aboriginal women around the north coast of New South Wales where he spent time as a boy. And he saw the way that they were abused and treated by men, black men and white men, but particularly white men. And he saw that as their suffering and the degradation that they felt, and he wanted to capture that. But what he failed to see was that those same women are mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers. The women that he writes about at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, that's my great-grandmother. She lived alongside Jimmy Governor. I knew her. She held me in her arms. These are the women he was writing about. He could not see the incredible capacity of Aboriginal women to not be defined by suffering, but to be defined by their endless capacity for love. And there is no love in this book for Aboriginal women. None. They don't have love. What they represent in fact, they have fallen from God's eye. That's the phrase that he uses. They have fallen from God's eye. If God is love, there is no God in their lives, and he fails to see that utterly about who we really were.
How does, and for Tom, when you talk to him about that now, how does he understand what was happening?
It's hard. It's Tom, you know, and I approach this with a lot of generosity and care, and I approach it in a gentle way with Tom because I'm not looking to condemn him. They're hard things to confront. Tom will see that. He can see the failing of that, and yet he still finds it, I think, difficult to answer to that. And so he's a bit evasive and he's embarrassed. And it's hard to confront any of those things, but he is absolutely fronted up to it. And we had a fantastic session at the Sydney Writers' Festival where we were able to have just this type of conversation. And he can recognise that. Now, Tom says he would not write the book in the same way. He would not try to speak in an Indigenous voice. I don't know if that's the right answer either.
No, yeah, that's a huge question and a big. It's one that troubles me.
Yeah.
And there are comrades, Aboriginal writers, who say to me, "You can't write in the consciousness of our people's Christos." And that is one of the arguments or debates or questions that I want to have with you. And I haven't come to a settlement at all, Stan, and I don't know if there is a settlement at the moment to be had over that.
Can anyone, can anyone?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something that really resonated. Two things, actually, that I thought, we're a similar age. And you talk about seeing the film, and let's talk about those, right? The film of Chain of Jimmy Blacksmith when you're a teenager. Same thing here. And it is still one of the most vivid memories of going to the cinema that I have. I will never forget it.
Never.
And I will never forget the horror of when Jimmy takes the axe and puts it through the heads of the children and the women, the white children, the white women, of the men who terrorised him, right? And I will never forget the elation I also felt.
I was exhilarated by that. Right, exhilarated by it. And that's a strange feeling when you see people's heads being caved in.
Yeah. And, my experience is nothing, I'm not an Aboriginal man, but there was something about what was said about the history and ugliness of racism that I understood on a visceral level.
Mm.
I'm not saying I understood it completely on an intellectual level. And the other thing that I was thinking about was your relationship to Ralph Ellison and The Invisible Man.
Yeah.
That still remains one of the most
Yeah.
astounding novels
Yeah.
I've ever read. I would like to ask you about the film and the experience of seeing that film for you, but also there's another ghost in the film, and that is Tom, the actor, right?
Yes, yes.
Tommy Lee gives one of the best performances ever in an Australian film.
Yeah.
And he's not a Wurundjeri man.
Never acted before.
Yeah. And what is the relationship you have to the film, and
Yeah.
what do you think of the ghost, Tom's ghost,
Yeah.
in terms of that film?
I got to know Tommy Lewis, really well later on in life. And when I first saw the film, I've grown up as an Aboriginal kid in Australia, knowing full well what that means, with a family that had lived at the absolute coalface of the brutality of the Australian frontier. I'm formed out of the Australian frontier. Jimmy Governor lived on the same missions as my grandparents and great-grandparents. I was raised on those stories. My mother and my father would tell me the stories of our history. I saw the scars on the bodies. My father carried the weight of this history on his skin and in his soul, and I saw that. We moved from town to town with no place to fit in, moving amongst our own communities, knowing full well we're on the margins of that society. Poor, black outsiders. When I first saw the film, we'd moved to Canberra for the last few years of my schooling. Dad got a job in a sawmill. Canberra was the whitest of white places. My sister and I were the only Aboriginal kids in the school, and I did not know how white people lived. I didn't get the jokes. I didn't know about the food they ate, these memories they had, these things that they did, holidays, and I just had no idea who these people were. And this film appears, and it brings together all of that for me. This film that is the chant of the underdog, the voice of the oppressed. And Jimmy, I remember this one moment where he's standing up on the hilltop and he's captured the school teacher, and they've kidnapped the school teacher, and the school teacher's writing down their story. And he says, at this point, the Boer War is on. And he says, yeah, that's what I've done. I've declared war. You tell them that I've declared war. That grabbed me. That sense that here we are speaking back to this. My brother and I used to act out scenes from the film, and the film led to the book. And so Tommy, when I looked at Tommy, that's us. When I looked at the images in the film, the way that Skepsy had recreated the missions, that's where I'd grown up. I was seeing ourselves on the screen. And then I went back and read the book. And the book took me to an even deeper place, because I could read it over and over and over, and there was something about the language and the chant. Tom wrote this as a chant. The repetition of language, the repetition of words, the way that Tom hypnotizes us with those words, it captivated me. And it gave me a story through which I could speak to the world, gave me an identity. But as I've grown with that book and read it over and over and over again, and passed on this book to my children, I've asked myself why. Why was I exhilarated? Why does an act of violence speak to me? What is it about myself that I need that? Is that really what Jimmy wanted?
What do your children say? How do they read it?
They know the same story. I think they're looking for similar things that I was at that age. But of course, now they can come to me and talk about this. At that point, this was all fresh to me. It was all new to me. I gave it to my youngest son when he graduated high school, along with a whole lot of books that I believed he needed to read, to be, to live in this world. And this was one of them. And he read it, and I think it answered some of the things that he sees in his grandfather, some of the distance, some of the hurt, some of the pain. And my kids, I think anyone who is conscious of our history, and my kids are, they also have that anger. Why? Why did this happen? Why did they do this to their grandfather and their grandmother? So it's real, and the hurt is real. But our struggle is, what do we do with it, Christos? What do we do with it? Am I forever is Jimmy going to be the ghost that I can never allow to be buried because I need him to speak back to the world? Or do I find my own voice?
Because I actually typed it out and I'm so glad you read from the section you did. But I want to ask the question is about what do we do? You know, where you said, and you know, you talk about the Allison, the invisible man exists on the fringes of modernity. You also write, as you said, existing between enlightenment and the dreaming, propelled by progress and liberalism, and yet also reaching back to keep hold on something eternal. I love that because I'm trying to make sense of what that eternal is. And I'm going to ask you, is that where you think I failed in my essay on Patrick White? Is that where you think Maloof failed in not comprehending that relationship?
I think we are so uncomfortable with even beginning to have that discussion, with opening our eyes to the truth of this country, that we can't even get on the same page. You know, and I talk about Patrick White because the book really, Keneally's book is a jumping off point. It's asking who writes the story of this land. Australia is absolutely an Enlightenment nation. It's founded modern Australia between the American Revolution and just before the French Revolution. What modernity is captured here. That universalism, that colonisation, empire, whiteness, the erasure of everything else in the quest for this idea of liberal freedom, a world beyond history. Because that's what liberalism promises us. It promises us a world beyond history. And that's the disconnect. In Australia, you, Christos, Patrick White, Tom Keneally, the people I talk about in this book, they only get to be, Kate Grenville, of course, who wrote, Secret River. They only get to be Australian writers because this land was stolen from us. It's the only reason they get to call themselves Australian writers. And in Patrick White's case, he wins a Nobel Prize, and the citation is that he wrote a new continent into world literature. What a thing for a son of England to write this continent into world literature when there'd been 100,000 years of story before Patrick White ever put pen to paper. And I looked at the Tree of Man, which is a phenomenal story because, as you rightly point out, it's an origin story. It's a Genesis story. Stan Parker goes out into a wilderness and he strikes a tree and he hits the tree with an axe and he realises that sound had never been heard here before. What an act of possession. And he clears the land and they build a community and they live and they love and they have tragedy and hope and survival. And there are no black people. And Patrick White, for you in your essay, became the entree to Australian literature. You get to call yourself an Australian writer because Patrick White opened up a space for that. And as you say, Patrick didn't write the Aboriginal Genesis story because that's not his to write and it's not yours to write. And where I took issue with that was, it is. It is because this is the story of this land. You don't write it with an axe. You don't erase us. You don't clear the land. Where on earth could you imagine people writing the story of a country? Ireland, China, Greece, and there are no Chinese people or Irish people or Greek people on the pages. But here we find it so easy to do because Patrick White opened a space for white Australian writers to do that. And what I was saying, and the thing when I spoke back to your essay, is saying, Christos, we are the story of this country. And if you enter that tradition, before you write a single word, you locate yourself within that tens of thousand years of tradition. It changes the way you write. It changes the way you see the country. Patrick White would have written entirely differently had he been cognizant of the story that was here. Instead, it's erased.
And that's where, where I read your essay and I thought that is its failure, because for me, there is something about the grasping for the eternal that White got in The Tree of Man. It is a profoundly spiritual novel, but my reading was that he found it through his partner Manolius and through Orthodox Eastern Christianity, and it was like, wow, and I ignored that there is another tradition. But I will ask you, I don't know. I think I can't write the Genesis story of this country. I said to you backstage that I hold that I am both. This is my country, but I'm also a guest in this country, and I don't think that is. And I think both those things are possible, and they're not for me. That is my understanding of where I am.
I think that's what Australia gives to us all. We are unsettled. There's that lovely line in the song that Briggs, the rapper had written, and he says, "We're both unsettled when the boats came." We're all unsettled. We are all unsettled, and that's a story. That's your story, and that's my story. That's a story of everyone in this room. You don't have to write the Genesis story. It's already here. But you live here, and this story has to be your story too. It doesn't mean that we speak in each other's voices. It doesn't mean that we appropriate each other's stories. It is that we are living in a country where we can no longer countenance the erasure of the Aboriginal story. It needs to be in everything that we do, in everything that we write. Overtly, covertly, the ghosts need to be there in everything that we write. We write a very different story of this country. I look at the political arguments around appropriation and who has the right to write a story. And I understand where that comes from, because when your voice has been denied, when you've been locked out, you want to claim that voice. And if other people claim that voice and they're already in a position of privilege, there is no space for you, for the Aboriginal writer. But I'm probably asking myself the question that comes after that. Okay, when we have claimed that voice, then what?
You do ask that in the essay.
Then what? Because there is a story beyond our differences. There is a story that is universal, and that's a story of love. On my mum's side, I have a white grandmother and a black grandfather. They can't be put in a box. There is no identity that can explain that love. It's bigger than all of that. How do you write that love if we are going to say only the black person gets to write it, or only the white person gets to write their story? There is a story beyond that, and that's what when we have the political discussion, when we've tallied the atrocities, when we've spoken to justice and we know that justice is still not delivered in this country, there is still a story, and it is a story that's bigger than politics and maybe bigger than justice, because it's a story of love. And, your wonderful book, Damascus, speaks to that void. It's set in biblical time, but it's speaking very much to our time. It's that, what is there if there is only just politics? If it's only just the Roman occupation? If it is only, slaves and masters, and what else is there?
I think for me, going back to that world that was not even Christian, it was so early on, was a way of trying to make sense of the contemporary without getting influenced by these necessary, difficult, complex conversations about identity and ownership. And
you weren't asking, could you write in a Jewish voice?
No, that's true. I think I remember being asked at a writers' festival before COVID hit, and we all had to go back home. But you know, someone asked me, "Do you think it's all right for a straight person to write in a gay voice?" And I went, "Of course." Like you know, that's not even a question for me, right? It is something, but very. What I do carry is the question because of the history of this place that I find myself in. It's not the same thing. I have no problem writing as a woman. I have no problem writing in those other voices, right? It is the voice of an Aboriginal person.
And that tells us something too, because you can see the humanity in the woman or the straight person or the gay person. Why can't you see the humanity in us?
I think I can do that. I can strive for that. And this isn't, but to get the anger and the rage, and let's go to the chant, right?
Yeah.
I worry that there is something, with all the necessary caution of what we live in the contemporary moment, I worry that we're too scared as writers. We don't have the courage to do that. So there is the love and there is the rage. I mean, that both of those things are at work in that
Damascus,
novel, right?
Yeah.
But how do we write that about the contemporary?
Yeah, and there's also something, you know, there is rage and there is love. I mean, I know if I look at my own life and if I just talk about my parents, my father was a wellspring of rage, a coiled anger. He was braced against the world. And he taught me from a young age to brace myself against the world too. He couldn't teach me how to do maths, but he could teach me how to throw a punch and to set myself to receive a punch. And he knew that I was going to need those things in the world that he had grown up in and lived in. And yet, amidst that anger and rage, I would see him sitting there sometimes just with this deep, deep sadness. You could just see it etched on his face. And my mother would sometimes walk by and she'd just touch the back of his neck. And I'd see him soften, and that love, it's all there. It's love and it's anger and it's rage and it's real and it's human and it's all there. And it's in you and it's in me and it's in everyone. And those things are not just assigned to politics and history. They're deeply human. And we've failed to see Aboriginal people as deeply human. They are caricatures. There is the noble savage. There is the doomed race, the dying race. There is the resistance fighter. There is never just the love and the human being. The other thing that I really struggle with when we come, and I do touch on this a little bit in the book too, is do Aboriginal writers have a mortgage on being able to tell the Aboriginal story? There's not just one Aboriginal story. No Aboriginal writer can capture the multiplicity of those stories. I could not possibly speak to an Aboriginal experience because there is not one. There are many. There are many.
That question of the eternal that I asked you before, is that one of the areas, that you want to challenge some of the Aboriginal writers that you talk about in the book?
I want to ask different questions. I think a lot of Indigenous literature, and I understand this impulse entirely, and I've written myself through this experience, is trying to speak back to be seen by, to be visible to say, I exist, I am here, I am human. And that can take many different forms. But there is a familiar trope to a lot of Indigenous literature that involves the journey, the spiritual journey, the physical journey, the reconnection, the return to country, the reclaiming of language, the buried history, the broken pieces, the effort to make whole, to complete. And I suppose I want to live with all the broken bits. I don't need to go back to country. Yes, it's important to me, but if I wasn't an Aboriginal person when I was living in Jerusalem or London or Beijing, what am I? I am the sum of all of those parts. I don't need to be completed or healed. I don't need to be reconciled. I don't need to tell history as truth-telling just so we get to a point in our history where we can say we are past that. I want to live with it all. I don't want to wrap it all up and complete it. I don't have to go back. So I suppose I challenge that idea too. And that's part of our journey as Indigenous writers.
I mean, I just recently watched the Martin Scorsese series on Fran Lebowitz, and in the final episode, for the people who haven't seen it, there's a really wonderful sequence where she goes, I can't do the Fran's voice, but, I never read to find myself. I read to discover something else. I'm not, I actually did also want to read to find myself, right? And that's why to the day I have my last breath, Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man will be such an essential part of who I am.
Yes.
But I also understand that there is that part. I also read to not see myself, but to be open to different experiences. And to
listen.
We can do both, can't we?
We can do both. And for that, I look to other writers who've been there. And I apologise if these are all men. That's probably another reflection of my own journey. But, these are the writers that spoke to me growing up. James Baldwin, who goes to France and says, I don't want to be a Negro, let alone a Negro writer. I am black. I'll define that. I'll say what that is. I'm not going to live in your box. Of course, James Joyce, the exiles, the people who leave to find something else. Czesław Miłosz, the wonderful Polish poet who's Lithuanian and lives in France and America and speaks every language except Lithuanian. And then when he gets his Nobel Literature Prize, in his speech says, perhaps I'm a Lithuanian for whom it was never meant to be a Lithuanian. I mean, what a sad, but that journey, I look to those writers, Russian writers. There's a wonderful writer who's just captivated me in recent times because I spent a lot of time in China as a reporter. But Yian Li, this Chinese writer, and she is just astounding. And she said something once. She said that she has, she's lived through the worst of China's history, and her family has lived through a history of revolution and suffering and famine and then the oppression of the Communist Party. And she's a doctor, and she moved to America and became a writer. And she has actually tried to forget her own language. She needs to forget it because that language speaks to such pain that she can't endure it. That's the inversion of the Aboriginal story where I want to reclaim language in a sense. Maybe we need to forget English because English is so painful. But she speaks to me. The writers of exile are the ones that I look to, not the writers of certainty and not the writers of identity. And unfortunately, it's so hard for us to write without the white man looking over our shoulder and to stop thinking about them. And as Toni Morrison said, to write free in a wholly genderized, sexualized, racialized world. She didn't write black stories, she wrote human stories.
I've only got to the tip of the questions I've got to ask, but I don't want to bogart Stan Grant because I know that there will be, there's times for questions. So I've been asked for COVID safety. If you've got a question, please come up to either of those little stands and the wonderful attendants will clean the microphone after each question. Please come up. There's one question I will ask you really quickly, Stan, to do with the arc of this conversation, and this I'm asking you as a writer. Is there something, you've worked as a journalist, you're a scholar, that's really evident in this book. Is there a way of failing that we need to be more generous about when it comes to fiction?
Oh, most definitely, because we're human, and to be human is to fail. And I think we forgive ourselves through our love and our generosity and through our understanding that in spite of all of that history, we share something. There is that lovely line of Terence, the Roman poet, who was a slave and left very little trace of his work except for a few sort of pieces that have been recovered. And Terence said, I am human. There is nothing that is human that is alien to me. Of course we need to be generous with our failings because that is the essence of who we are as human beings.
I think that's the generosity that you show in this book and you show to Mr. Keneally as well. Now, my friends, are there questions? Is anyone?
We can't have answered them all.
Come on.
Someone's stirring in their seat somewhere. Not one? Yeah. My God, I thought talk about failure. I've sent you all into a stupor.
I have my son here with me tonight, so it piqued my interest when you said, I gave my son this reading list of the the books that I thought he would like to read. Could you share what that list of books was, please?
Yes. There was Tom Keneally, Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. There was The Tree of Man. I think that's a really, really important book for Australia. There was a book of Chekhov short stories. There were a couple of Yi-Un Lee books because I think she's just someone who speaks to this contemporary age. He picked out Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment for himself. I gave him Portrait of an Artist as a young man. I gave him Because a White Man Will Never Do It, Kevin Gilbert's poetry, an Aboriginal poet who's related to me, my father's cousin. I gave him the things that have spoken to me because I know they're the questions he's going to ask as well. And he may not read them all and he may not understand them all, and I still don't understand them all. But those words will speak to him in some way. They will find him in some way. And it will pique his interest in literature and stories and poetry and be, a lodestar, a guiding light for him as he takes his own journey. I don't want to turn him into a little mini-me, but they're the things that really spoke to me, and I'd like that to be part of my legacy to him. Another one? Yeah. See, questions are like the stars at night. You see one, and then suddenly there's 100 of them. I don't think white Australia has a problem with ignoring us at all. I think that's the problem. I think white Australia is very comfortable with the Australia they have. Otherwise, why would we allow Aboriginal people to die 10 years younger than the rest of the population? We're just emerging, thankfully, hopefully, out of COVID. We have moved heaven and earth to hold at bay this pandemic that has crippled the world. We found money for JobKeeper and JobSeeker. We helped people get to the other side. And when we emerge from this and we're vaccinated, we're back at work and we're back at the footy, we're back at the gigs, and Aboriginal people will still be dying 10 years younger. A third of the population, 3% of the population will be a third of the prison population. And writers will have no problem writing stories and calling themselves Australian writers where we simply don't exist. And there'll be no mention of the frontier wars on the roll of remembrance, the roll of honour at the War Memorial. And we'll still talk about Australia as being this beacon of democracy and this bastion of security and tolerance and cohesion, all the things that it can rightly lay claim to, while ignoring who's paid the greatest price for that. I think we find it very easy. And that's why our voices need to be heard, and that's why we need to write stories. But for me, to try to redeem that history, for me to try to reconcile those things. I'm not there. I want to live with it all of the broken pieces, all of the contradiction. I'm not in a hurry to reconcile or resolve anything because I don't think the country wants to reconcile or resolve anything either. It is who we are. That's who we are. You're another one.
If
Yeah,
yeah, please come up on the.
great shirt. That's fantastic.
Thank you. Hi, Stan. I wanted to ask about, you've mentioned tonight and in the book that you don't need to be made whole in culture or in language, but there's another passage in the book, and I thought it was one of the most moving ones, had a lot of pathos, where you say that we've never lived that Australia, we've never lived that country of
Yeah.
First Nations languages and cultures. How do these two things coexist?
It's just a statement of reality. It's a statement of fact. There is an Australia, I say in the book, there is an Australia that I imagine, an Australia where we weren't erased, an Australia where we came here and we didn't invade and slaughter and exclude, where we learned to speak First Nations languages, where Australian writers begin before they write a word with locating themselves in our story, not erasing our story, where you don't write stories with an axe. But we've never lived that Australia. That's just the truth. That Australia is lost. We never got a chance to live that Australia because we have never, and I say this in the book, we have never asked this very simple question. This is your country. Excuse me, do you mind if we live here too? Never asked it.
Anyone else? I'm I'm conscious that we're near the end, but there is a question I want to ask about Jimmy. I want to keep returning to Jimmy's governor, not necessarily Jimmy Blacksmith, right? The ghost is in your book. That's one of the things most moving for me about this essay. Do you want to give him a voice in fiction, Stan? Is that something that you've lived with him for so long?
Yeah, you're reading my mind. I've always thought this, that Jimmy's story needs to be told. And if I was to write the novel that Tom didn't write, what would it be about? Would it be the murder? Would it be the anger, the vengeance? Would it be the brutality of the frontier? Or would it be that one day Jimmy saw a girl? He saw this girl and she looked at him. And these people from such different worlds and across a racial barrier in a country that didn't see black people as human fell in love. That's the Jimmy Governor story. That's the tenderness of that story. He was a man capable of extraordinary violence, extreme violence. I mean, what he did, there is nothing, you can't redeem him from that act of violence, but his love redeems him. And they loved each other.
Would love to read that novel because we haven't written it.
We haven't written it, and it's the love that I see in my own family. It's the love that's bigger than Australia. It's the love that can't be put in boxes. And it's a love that doesn't need identity. And it's a love that all of us know and all of us can write.
Do you have a question? And then Sarah's going to say.
I'm just really enjoying your generosity and I guess the thoughtful, peaceful reflection that you're at. How did you get to be at this point where you are so generous in in a situation where obviously a lot of that anger could have stayed. I have another question about how to help Aboriginal people write their stories.
We don't need help.
Well, this particular woman might, because she's in Roper Valley, Northern Territory, remote outstation, and she wants to write story.
Yeah.
But that's probably a bit longer.
But, you know...
But I'd love to know about your story.
I am angry, and it's always there, and it doesn't take much for that to come out at all. And sometimes it can come from nowhere. It can choke me, you know, and it hangs over everything in my life. You know, even my relationship with my wife, who's a non-Indigenous Australian, and there are things between us that we can't know. And there is an anger there that she knows exists in me at the treatment of my people and what this country has done that I don't want to let go of. Anger is an ethical response and probably the right response to what's happened here. But what do I do with it? And I read and I think and I write, and I know that in spite of all of the things that have happened here, my family's story is a story of love, of their culture and this country and each other. And you know, I am not just one thing. I was brought up on that's why Christos's book on Damascus just spoke to me so powerfully. I was brought up in the church. I was brought up on the missions. My uncle and my grandfather were the pastors in the church. You know, we'd go there, and this wasn't white church. This was the church of the forsaken. This is, my God, why have you forsaken me? You know, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. This is, you know, the old rugged cross. Shall we gather at the river? You know, these hymns that speak of being left behind and forgotten, but holding on to each other. And I draw on all of that, and I read and I think, and I'm fighting against that anger all the time, and I like to write. And there's a lot of anger in this book, and sometimes I think it probably explodes onto the page. But then I look for something else as well, and I have a philosophical nature and a philosophical soul, and that helps me, you know, make sense of those things. And I just want to be free. I want to be free of all of that history, and I wanted Jimmy to be free of those things too.
I think generosity and anger can go together, and that's been my experience of you, Stan. And also, I just wanted to be really clear. I think, you know, it's about Jimmy Governor's love. That's the story I haven't written. I mean, Alexis Wright has written Love and the Eternal. You know, Tony Birch. I mean, there's one of the greatest films we ever made in this country is Tracy Moffat's Big Devil, which is about ghosts. So it is about love and is about...
Melissa Lukashenko writes about love.
Yes,
hope,
I just wanted to be clear.
You know, our people are writing about this all the time, but we're always cast as the voice of anger or the voice of protest, and we're all of those things too, but we have big love.
Can you please give a big round of applause to Stan Grant?
Thank you so much for coming.
His generosity.
Really appreciate it.
He will be signing books at the end of this session. Thank you so very much.